If all your money vanished tomorrow, who would still stay? That question haunted Oliver Whitman long after the lights from his 38th birthday party had dimmed. The ballroom of the Whitman Tower had reeked of champagne and expensive loneliness. Everyone was laughing too loudly, flattering too quickly, touching his arm as if affection could be measured by proximity to power. When the last guest left, and the string quartet's final note dissolved into the velvet air, he stood before the mirrored window of his penthouse, watching his own reflection blur against the Manhattan skyline. Beyond the glass, the city pulsed greedy, sleepless, familiar. He took another sip of scotch. It burned less than it used to. Money had made him bulletproof, but it had also made him untouchable. It came to him like a half-joke, whispered by the ghost of his better self. What if you gave it all away, not forever, just to see what people would do with it? He smiled to himself, but it wasn't amusement. It was curiosity, tinged with something rawer desperation, disguised as intellect. That night, he called his private banker and requested 4 black credit cards, each tied to an unlimited account. Then he sat at his desk, staring at the embossed letters of his name, and thought about the women around him, 4 lives orbiting his wealth in different ways. There was Vanessa, his ex-girlfriend, sculpted by ambition and champagne; Claire, his sharp-minded assistant, who admired him a little too carefully; Lydia, a socialite who spoke in headlines and laughter; and then Grace, the housekeeper who sang gospel hymns off-key while scrubbing the marble floors. She had worked for him 3 years and never asked for a raise, never once looked him directly in the eye longer than necessary. He had never asked about her life, because it didn't seem to intersect with his world. Until now. The next morning, he gathered them one by one, to the first 3. He spoke with effortless charm, that polished charisma he wore like armor. "I'm giving each of you this card," he said, sliding the sleek rectangle across the table. "Unlimited balance. Use it however you want. For 3 days. No questions asked." The women laughed, assuming it was a test or a gift. He smiled back, never clarifying which. But when Grace entered the study, the mood shifted. She stood at the door, still wearing her cleaning uniform, a faint scent of lemon and soap clinging to her skin. Sir Oliver gestured for her to sit. She hesitated. "This is for you." He slid the card toward her. Same rules. 3 days. Spend it however you wish. Grace looked at the card as if it were a live animal. "Sir, there must be a mistake. I just came to clean the window." "No mistake." She blinked, confused. "But why me?" Oliver tilted his head, watching her. "Because you're the only one who didn't ask." She didn't touch the card right away. Her fingers hovered above it, trembling slightly. "Finally," she said quietly. "I wouldn't know what to buy. I already have everything I need, except maybe some luck." He almost laughed, but the way she said it, half prayer, half surrender, made his throat tighten. "Then maybe this," he said softly, "is your chance to borrow mine. For 3 days. Oliver buried himself in work, but couldn't focus. His assistant's voice faded. The city meetings blurred. He found himself checking transaction alerts, like a child peeking at Christmas presents too early. Vanessa bought jewelry in Paris. Lydia chartered a yacht in Miami. Claire wired funds to a shell company. He expected as much. Predictable. Boring. But when he clicked on Grace's statement, his cursor hesitated. The first line read, Farmer's Market, Bronx, $46 toward. The next, Toy Outlet, $228.90. Then Supermart, $510. And then again, and again, the same name repeated with small amounts. No designer stores, no flights, no luxury brands. At the bottom of the list, one purchase stood out: 200 hot dogs, 10 gallons of milk, 300 balloons. Oliver frowned. What the hell is she doing for the first time in years? He felt something entirely unfamiliar. Curiosity that had nothing to do with profit. On the third evening, he couldn't take it anymore. He drove himself no driver, no convoy through the narrow streets of the Bronx, following the address on her last receipt. The neighborhood was a patchwork of shadows and neon signs. Rain drizzled lightly, painting halos around the street lamps. He parked near an old building with chipped paint and a crooked sign that read, St. Francis Home for Children. Inside, laughter echoed. Through the window, he saw Grace wearing a clown's nose, her hair tied in a messy bun, surrounded by children waving balloons. She was teaching them how to make animals out of them, her voice off-key but full of light. The floor was a chaos of colors: red, yellow, green. The smell of grilled sausages drifted through the air. He watched as she knelt beside a small boy crying over a broken balloon. She dabbed his tears with her apron and whispered, "See? Even broken things can make someone smile, if you hold them right." The boy giggled. She laughed too, a sound so unpolished and honest that it sliced through Oliver's polished composure like a warm knife. For a long moment, he stood there, drenched in drizzle, watching through the glass. He had seen women cry on red carpets, smile through interviews, perform tenderness like a rehearsed act. But this unguarded kindness felt dangerous. Something unfamiliar stirred beneath his ribs. He thought of his penthouse silent, cold, clean, the way he'd filled it with art and still couldn't fill the emptiness inside it. And now, this woman, this ordinary brune, infuriatingly real woman, was filling a room with laughter, using the same card others used, for greed. He didn't understand it. He only knew he couldn't look away. When the rain thickened, he finally turned to leave, his reflection flickering in the glass. Grace looked up just in time to see a tall shadow disappear beyond the gate. For a moment, their eyes met only a heartbeat, no words. She didn't know who was watching, but something in her chest trembled, as if the air had shifted. Later that night, Oliver sat in his car outside his building, hands still gripping the steering wheel. His chest felt tight, though he wasn't sure why. Guilt, envy, he replayed her laugh in his head, the way her eyes softened when she looked at those children. He wondered when was the last time someone had looked at him with that same warmth, or if anyone ever had. He told himself it was just curiosity. Yet when he saw her handwriting on the receipt for those 100 hot dogs, something inside him softened like thawing glass. In the silence of his penthouse, the black cards lay scattered across the marble counter tokens of his arrogance. He thought of the women who would wake tomorrow with hangovers and shopping bags, their laughter still echoing from yachts and penthouses. And then he thought of Grace probably cleaning up a room full of sleeping children, still smelling faintly of balloons and mustard. A faint pang of shame ran through him. For the first time, Oliver wondered if the test he had created wasn't about them at all, but about the emptiness inside himself. He leaned back, eyes closed, whispering to the dark. Maybe I've been measuring the wrong kind of wealth all along. When dawn crept through the blinds, he made up his mind. He would visit the orphanage, not as a billionaire, but as a man with questions. Somewhere deep down, he knew this experiment had already failed. Because experiments don't make your heart race. Experiments don't make you remember the way someone laughs. And as he glanced at her name one last time on the transaction list, Oliver Whitman, the man who had everything, realized he had just found something he didn't know he'd been searching for. Something that scared him more than losing all his money. Morning spilled through Manhattan like melted gold, indifferent and loud. In his penthouse high above the city, Oliver Whitman sat at his dining table, staring at a single receipt still lying there. St. Francis Home for Children, $510. The ink had begun to fade, but the handwriting was still there, neat, careful, slightly tilted, as if written by someone afraid to take too much space. He'd told himself that what he felt last night was curiosity. But when dawn arrived, and the city began to hum again, that curiosity refused to fade. It grew heavier, almost personal, a weight in his chest that no meeting or investment call could dissolve. For the first time in years, he canceled everything. No meetings, no assistants, no pretense. He grabbed his coat and left the tower alone. The drive to the Bronx was longer than he remembered. Outside the tinted glass, New York's elegance gave way to chipped brick walls and laundry lines that fluttered like prayer flags. It wasn't poverty that struck him. It was the color of resilience, painted in mismatched blues and faded reds. When he arrived at St. Francis, a thin drizzle hung in the air. The building was old but alive, children's laughter leaking through cracked windows, like sunlight sneaking past curtains. He hesitated at the gate, unsure if he was intruding. A small girl ran past, chasing a balloon. It slipped from her hand and rose high, brushing against his shoulder before vanishing into the clouds. She looked up at him, disappointed. Without thinking, he knelt, took off his watch, a sleek silver piece worth more than the entire building, and handed her the shiny black box it came in. "Here," he said softly. "You can keep something that doesn't fly away." The girl smiled, the kind of smile that didn't know what wealth meant, and ran off again. And just like that, the noise of the city disappeared. Inside, he found Grace wiping tables, humming something soft under her breath. No uniform this time, just a worn gray sweater, sleeves rolled to the elbow. Her hair was tied in a loose knot, stray curls framing her face, like a question he didn't yet know how to answer. She didn't notice him right away. The children gathered around her like planets around a small sun, and she moved among them with a rhythm of kindness that made everything else fade. When she finally looked up, surprise crossed her face, then confusion. "Mr. Whitman," she said, almost disbelieving. Her voice was the same as he remembered, soft, low, carrying a trace of music. "I was in the neighborhood." He lied gently. "Thought I'd stop by." Grace raised an eyebrow. In this neighborhood, he smiled. I got lost. She laughed quietly, shaking her head. You don't look like a man who gets lost easily. Oliver stepped closer. The children's chatter filled the space between them like harmless static. I do sometimes, he said. Just not on maps. When the children ran outside to play, the room fell into a peaceful mess: crayons, napkins, balloons deflated in corners. Grace sat at one of the small tables, pouring juice into plastic cups. Oliver leaned against the doorframe, watching her hands move gentle, deliberate, as if every motion deserved respect. I saw what you did here, he said. She didn't look up. And what did you see, sir? A room full of joy, bought with a credit card that could have bought anything. Her lips curved slightly. Children are cheaper than yachts, but more expensive to the heart. He replied without thinking. She glanced up then, meeting his gaze. Something passed between them, a small, still spark that neither wanted to name. Why did you really give me that card? She asked. He exhaled. Because I wanted to see who I could trust. And did you? He hesitated. I'm starting to. Grace smiled faintly, as if she didn't quite believe him, but wanted to. You can't test kindness, Mr. Whitman. It only shows itself when no one's watching. He thought about that long after she said it. As she spoke with the children, he noticed the faint scar near her wrist, a pale reminder of something old. Later, when the others went outside, curiosity slipped through his restraint. Can I ask about that? Grace looked down, then covered it with her sleeve. It's from before, she said simply. Before I learned that not everyone who promises care actually means it. Her voice didn't tremble, but her hands stilled. Oliver felt something twist inside him, a quiet anger at a faceless man from her past, at the injustice of gentleness hurt by carelessness. He wanted to say something, to fix it somehow, but the words refused to come. So instead, he said softly, You deserve more than promises. Grace looked at him for a long second, long enough for the silence to feel intimate, not empty. They spent the afternoon patching broken toys. Oliver sat awkwardly on the floor, knees bent, tie loosened, trying to fix a plastic car while Grace watched, amused. You're doing that backward, she teased. I run an empire, he said, grinning. How hard can this be? Empires fall, she said gently. Toys survive. He looked up, surprised by the poetry hidden in her voice. Outside, rain tapped on the windows, a rhythm too tender for thunder. Grace moved closer to show him how to align the wheels, her shoulder brushing his arm. It was accidental, but the contact lingered longer than it should have. Neither of them pulled away immediately. He smelled soap and rain, and something faintly sweet, maybe vanilla. She smelled like real life. For a moment, Oliver forgot that he was a billionaire, forgot the marble floors and glass walls of his tower. All he knew was this, a small room, 2 people, and a silence that didn't need to be filled. As the rain quieted, Grace asked softly, Do you ever get tired of it? Of what? Having everything. Oliver looked out the window at the children chasing puddles. Everything is the loneliest number, he said finally. She nodded, as if she understood. When I had nothing, at least I knew what I was missing. having everything. That must be harder. He turned to her. It is. Because then, there's nothing left to want until someone makes you want again. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Grace looked at him, really looked, and something flickered in her eyes, somewhere between surprise and warmth. But before either of them could speak, the door opened and the children rushed in, shouting about rainbows. The moment vanished, like breath on glass. When the afternoon faded and the children began to nap, Oliver walked her to the gate. The air smelled of wet earth and sugar, the scent of a world unpolished and beautiful. "Will you come back?" she asked, half teasing, half serious. He smiled. "Only if you promise not to make me fix more toys." Grace folded her arms. "No promises. You might deserve that." He laughed, the sound lighter than he'd expected. For a second, she looked at him differently, not as her employer, not as a man of money, but simply as a man standing in the rain, trying to learn something about kindness. He wanted to say something, then something real, but words felt too heavy, too soon. So instead, he said, "Thank you for reminding me what joy looks like." Grace tilted her head, smiling softly. "You didn't forget. You just stopped visiting it." Back in his car, Oliver sat for a long moment before turning the key. The city stretched ahead, but he didn't drive toward home. He looked once more at the orphanage at the window, where she stood waving absent-mindedly, her reflection half lost in the glass. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man testing others. He felt like a man being changed slowly, irrevocably, by the quiet strength of someone who had nothing but still gave everything. As he drove away, he whispered to himself, "Maybe trust isn't earned by wealth, but by the way someone spends what little they have." Outside, the rain had stopped, but the world still shimmered. And somewhere in that shimmer, Oliver realized that curiosity had turned into something far more dangerous, the beginning of care. The city was still half asleep when Oliver woke the next morning. Sunlight spilled lazily across the marble floors, glinting off untouched silverware and the half-empty glass of wine he had forgotten to finish the night before. But what woke him wasn't the sun. It was memory, the echo of a voice saying, "You didn't forget joy. You just stopped visiting it." Grace's words lingered like perfume after someone leaves a room faint but impossible to ignore. He had heard thousands of people talk about success, about growth, about happiness, but no one had ever spoken to him about joy, as if it were something you could lose and find again. He tried to work. He couldn't. Tried to read. Failed. By noon, he was standing in front of the elevator mirror, buttoning his coat, telling himself he was just going to check on the orphanage project. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the truth. Grace wasn't at the orphanage that day. Margaret, the manager, told him she was on her lunch break at a cafe nearby, the little one with the blue awning. He found it easily, a modest place on a quiet corner, the kind where the air smelled of roasted beans and fresh rain. Inside, the tables were uneven, the windows fogged from warmth, and a radio played a song about love too old to remember its own name. Grace sat near the window, a paperback open, her hands cupped around a chipped mug of coffee. She didn't see him walk in. For a moment, Oliver just stood there watching. In her work uniform. She looked like anyone else. But there was a calmness in the way she occupied the space, unhurried, unpretentious, that made the world slow around her. He realized, with quiet astonishment, that she belonged here. And he didn't. He approached, clearing his throat softly. "Do you mind if I join you?" Grace looked up, startled. Her eyes widened slightly, then softened. "Mr. Whitman," she said, half smiling. "Are you following me now?" He smiled too, only when my calendar mysteriously empties itself. She gestured to the seat opposite. "Then sit. But I can't promise the coffee will suit your billionaire taste buds." "I'll risk it," he said. For a while, they drank in silence. The cafe was nearly empty. The only sound, the soft hiss of the espresso machine and the rain tapping against the window. Oliver studied her. She read slowly, lips moving faintly, like she was tasting the words. "Do you always read at lunch?" he asked. "Only when I want to remember who I am," she said. He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Grace closed her book, looking thoughtful. "When you clean other people's homes long enough, you start to forget yours. The stories remind me I still have a life that's mine, even if it's just in my head." Oliver looked down, feeling a strange discomfort in his chest. He had spent his whole life owning things, buildings, cars, companies, yet suddenly, he was sitting across from someone whose ownership of herself seemed like a kind of wealth he'd never known. "That's beautiful," he said quietly. She smiled, sipping her coffee. "It's just survival." Their eyes met, not for long, but long enough for him to feel the subtle shift again. That slow tightening of air between two people who shouldn't be this close, but already are. "Grace," he said after a moment, "why didn't you ever tell me about the orphanage, or what you do there?" She tilted her head. "Would you have listened?" The question hit harder than he expected. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. She was right. A year ago, he wouldn't have noticed. "I would now," he said softly. Grace nodded, not as forgiveness, but as acknowledgement. Then she asked, "And why did you come here today?" "Really?" Oliver hesitated. The truth felt too heavy to admit aloud. "I wanted to see if what I felt yesterday was real," he said finally. She studied him, her gaze neither shy nor bold, just searching. "And was it?" He exhaled slowly. "It is now." Her lips parted slightly, but before she could reply, the waitress arrived with refills, breaking the moment like a ripple across still water. The conversation turned lighter. She asked about his favorite book, and he realized with quiet embarrassment that he hadn't read for pleasure in years. She laughed, not cruelly, but warmly. "That's a shame," she said. "Books are how people travel when they can't afford tickets." He chuckled. "I can buy every ticket in the world and still feel stuck." "Then you're not reading the right stories," she said simply. Her ease disarmed him. The way she moved her hands when she spoke, the way she smiled without effort, it all made him forget the world outside that cafe. For a moment, they weren't Billionaire and MAID. They were just two souls sharing the same small warmth in a cold city. But reality, as it always does, found its way back. The door chimed. A woman walked in tall, elegant, the kind of beauty that belonged in glossy magazines. "Oliver," she said. Disbelief laced with delight. He froze. "Vanessa." Grace looked up, her smile fading. Vanessa stepped closer, touching his arm with practiced intimacy. "I thought you were in London this week." Oliver cleared his throat, stepping back slightly. Plans changed. Her gaze flicked toward Grace, assessing, dismissing. "And you're having coffee here?" She said here like it was a flaw. Grace stood, collecting her things quietly. "I should go." "Wait, Grace," Oliver said, rising too. "This isn't—" But she was already halfway to the door, her back straight, her pace calm. Vanessa gave a soft, amused smile. "Friend of yours?" Oliver didn't answer. He only watched Grace leave, the bell chiming as the door closed behind her, and felt something twist painfully inside him. He caught up with her, a block later. The rain had started again, fine and steady. "Grace, please." She stopped but didn't turn around. "You don't have to explain. I know what it looked like." "I don't care what it looked like," he said. You don't have to. Mr. Whitman." Her tone was gentle, not angry. "You live in a world where people touch your arm before asking who you are. I live in one where we clean up after those parties. There's no shame in that difference, but it is a difference." He stepped closer, rain dripping from his coat. "I didn't come for her. I came for you." Grace turned then, eyes glistening, not from tears, but from rain. "And what exactly do you want from me?" He hesitated. There it was, the question he hadn't asked himself. He didn't have an answer yet, only a truth he barely understood. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe to feel something real again." Grace looked at him for a long, quiet second. Then she said softly, "Be careful, Oliver. Sometimes real things hurt more than the lies we're used to." And with that, she walked away, not running, not angry, just steady. He stood there, soaked, watching her disappear into the blur of umbrellas and city light. That night, back in his penthouse, Oliver couldn't sleep. The rain kept tapping against the glass, the same rhythm that had filled the cafe, the street, his thoughts. He tried to distract himself. News, calls, numbers, but none of it mattered. What haunted him wasn't her leaving. It was how calm she'd been when she did. He realized then that Grace's strength came from something money couldn't give or take, and that terrified him. Because for the first time, Oliver Whitman, man of control, master of his empire, felt utterly powerless. He closed his eyes, and in the silence, her words echoed. Sometimes real things hurt more than the lies we're used to. Outside, the storm finally broke. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and violet, and somewhere far away, a gospel song played from a street vendor's radio, off-key, but achingly alive. Oliver stood by the window, his reflection fractured by raindrops. He wasn't sure what Grace had awakened in him: guilt, wonder, desire, or redemption, only that it was growing. He whispered into the empty room, "She's not part of my world, but she's the only part that feels like home." and as thunder rolled beyond the skyline, he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't an experiment anymore. It was the beginning of something he couldn't control. For 3 days after the cafe, Grace didn't answer his calls. Oliver told himself he understood that she needed space, that silence was dignity in disguise. But understanding didn't stop him from waiting. He waited through meetings he couldn't hear, dinners he didn't taste, and nights where the city glittered like a million lies he no longer believed in. It was absurd. He thought how a man could build skyscrapers and still be undone by a woman who lived 2 train rides away. Yet every time it rained, every time coffee steamed in his cup, he felt her there, her laughter, her stillness. The way she said real things hurt. On the 4th morning, he couldn't take it anymore. He drove to the orphanage again, this time without calling first. The yard was quiet, washed clean by rain. Children's drawings fluttered on the fence, their colors soft and running from the moisture. Grace was there, kneeling under the awning, helping a little boy tie his shoelaces. When she saw him, surprise flickered across her face, followed by something gentler, like resignation. "Mr. Whitman," she said, standing. "I thought billionaires melted in the rain." He smiled faintly. "Only the lonely ones." The boy ran off, leaving them standing a few feet apart, the scent of wet earth and soap between them. "Why are you here?" she asked. He searched for an answer that wouldn't sound foolish. "I didn't come to apologize," he said finally. "You were right. We live in different worlds. But lately, yours feels like the only one that's real." Grace folded her arms, as if steadying herself. "And what are you hoping to find here?" "Oliver, forgiveness, redemption." "Neither," he said softly. "I just wanted to see you smile again." Her eyes flickered, betraying something she tried to hide. They spent the morning fixing a leaky pipe in the kitchen. Grace handed him a wrench, rolling her eyes every time he fumbled. "Don't tell me you built an empire and can't fix a faucet." "I hire people for that," he muttered. "Maybe that's the problem." He looked at her, then not at her hands or her smile, but at the quiet strength beneath her teasing. She didn't just fill spaces, she grounded them. When the pipe finally stopped dripping, she exhaled in triumph. "See, not everything needs to be replaced. Some things just need patience." Oliver wiped his hands on a rag, staring at her. "That line should be carved on every boardroom wall." She laughed, the sound light and unguarded. It was the first time he'd heard it since that day in the cafe, and it hit him like sunlight through clouded glass. Later, they sat outside with 2 mugs of instant coffee. He watched her as she blew gently across the cup, eyes half closed. "I want to help," he said suddenly. "With the orphanage. The building's falling apart." Grace shook her head. "We're managing. Managing isn't the same as thriving. Thriving isn't always the goal." He frowned. "Why do you keep refusing help?" "Because it always comes with a price," she said simply. "I'm not buying you." "Grace." "I know," she said quietly. "But money changes things, even the way people look at each other." Her voice softened then, as if she regretted the sting in her words. "You wouldn't understand that. You've never had to wonder if kindness had strings attached." Oliver set his cup down, staring at the puddles forming on the ground. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that he'd been surrounded by strings his entire life, each one woven from expectation and loneliness. But he didn't. He just said, "I understand more than you think." She looked at him then, and for a heartbeat, the distance between their worlds seemed almost bridgeable. When the rain returned that afternoon, they stayed under the awning, listening to it drum on the tin roof. Grace closed her eyes. Her face tilted slightly upward. "You like the rain?" he asked. "It's honest," she said. "It doesn't care who you are. It falls on penthouses and shacks the same way." He watched a droplet slide down her cheek, catching the light like a tear. He wanted to reach out, to brush it away, but he didn't. Instead, he whispered, "You make everything sound simpler than it is." "Maybe things are simple," she said. "People just make them hard." The silence that followed was soft and charged, like the air before lightning. He could feel her nearness, the warmth radiating from her, the rhythm of her breathing. If he moved an inch closer, he could have kissed her. But he didn't, because for the first time, Oliver realized that wanting someone wasn't the same as deserving them. A car pulled up at the gate, sleek, black, out of place. His assistant, Claire, stepped out, heels sharp against the gravel. "Mr. Whitman," she called. Her tone clipped. "You missed 2 meetings. The board's waiting." Grace stepped back immediately, the spell between them breaking. "I should go," she said, turning away. Grace. But she was already walking toward the kitchen, shoulders tense. Claire approached, giving him a look halfway between concern and warning. "Oliver, this isn't a good idea." He turned to her. "What isn't? Coming here. Getting involved." Her gaze darted toward the orphanage. "It's not your world, and it won't end well. People talk. Let them." She sighed. "You're risking everything for someone who doesn't even want your help." He stared past her, toward the door Grace had disappeared behind. Maybe that's why she's worth it. That evening, thunder rolled over the city. Oliver sat alone in his car, parked across from the orphanage, rain blurring the windshield. Inside, lights glowed warm and dim. He could see shadows moving. Grace checking on the children, closing windows, humming softly. He wanted to go back in, to tell her that he didn't care about the noise, the difference, the risk, that every part of him, every logical, careful part, had already lost the fight. But something stopped him. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was respect. Maybe both. So he stayed there, watching until the lights went out one by one, until the world was dark again. Inside, Grace sat by the window long after the children had fallen asleep. Her fingers traced the rim of her teacup absently. She could still feel the way Oliver had looked at her, not like a man looking down, but like someone finally seeing her. And that scared her. People like him didn't fall in love with people like her. Not really. Not for long. The world had rules, invisible but ironclad, and breaking them always came with a price. Yet when she closed her eyes, she saw him standing in the rain, hands in his pockets, waiting like a boy who'd lost his way. She whispered to the night, "Don't make me hope for something that can't last." By dawn, Oliver had made a decision. If Grace wouldn't let him help through money, then he'd find another way, quieter, humbler, something that didn't feel like charity. He called his architect, arranged for anonymous repairs to be made to the orphanage's plumbing and roof. He told no one else. It wasn't strategy. It was gratitude, the kind that didn't ask to be seen. That night, when he walked past the mirror in his penthouse, he almost didn't recognize himself. The man in the reflection looked softer somehow, not weaker, but more human. For years, Oliver Whitman had believed that control was strength. Now he wondered if maybe strength was learning how to let go. The next weekend, Grace arrived at the orphanage to find the leaks gone, the walls repainted, the children cheering about the magic roof. Margaret said someone anonymous had paid for it all. Grace didn't need to ask who. Later that evening, as she walked home under a pink-gold sky, she saw him waiting across the street, hands in pockets. No chauffeur, no pretense. She crossed slowly, her heart unsteady. "You did this," she said softly. He shook his head. "No, I just fixed what I broke." Grace looked at him for a long moment, torn between admiration and fear. "Oliver, you can't save everything." He smiled sadly. "I'm not trying to save everything. Just one thing worth believing in." The wind carried the smell of rain, again sharp, clean, inevitable. And as it began to fall, they stood there, two people from opposite worlds, both too proud and too afraid to call what they felt by its real name. But the storm didn't ask for permission. It simply began, and so did they. The week after the rain felt almost weightless. The leaks at St. Francis were gone. The paint smelled faintly of lemon and hope. And for a few fragile days, Grace let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, miracles could come wearing a suit and a crooked smile. Oliver visited often, never announced, never as Mr. Whitman. He came carrying groceries instead of gifts, hammer instead of headlines. He read stories to the children. Badly. He burned pancakes. Twice. Grace laughed until she forgot to be careful. Each evening, when he left, the air between them stayed full of unsaid things, soft, tremulous, dangerous. Back in Manhattan, the world noticed. Photos surfaced, the billionaire in a run-down neighborhood, sleeves rolled, laughing among children. At first, the tabloids treated it as novelty philanthropy or folly. Then came the sharper lines. Who is the maid behind the man? Oliver's board called an emergency meeting. Investors muttered about distraction. Claire handed him a folder thick with headlines. "You wanted real," she said. "This is what real costs." He closed the file. Let them talk. But that night, alone in the penthouse, he looked at the city through the huge glass wall and felt the first crack form, not in the glass, but inside him. He had built a life out of transparency and still managed to hide himself from everyone, including her. Grace read the same articles days later. Her photo smiling at the orphanage gate sat beside headlines that reduced her to a curiosity, the housekeeper and the heir. She felt the eyes in the grocery store, the whispers on the subway. Charity workers who once greeted her warmly now looked uncertain, weighing which story to believe. That evening, she locked herself in the kitchen, hands trembling around a teacup. Margaret knocked softly. "You should talk to him." Grace shook her head. "He doesn't need another scandal. He'll be fine." But she knew she wasn't fine. because every cruel word on those pages reminded her of the gap between them, how wide, how impossible. Oliver showed up late. Rain still on his coat. "Grace, I saw," she said quietly. "All of it." He moved closer. But she stepped back. "You shouldn't be here. People already think I'm after your money. I don't care what they think. Maybe you should." Her voice cracked, small and tired. "You have an empire to protect. I have a job I love. The children, they don't deserve the noise." He reached for her hand. "I didn't mean for this to happen." She pulled away. "That's the thing about people like you, Oliver. You never mean for it to happen. But it happens. And the rest of us have to live with the ruins." He looked at her, then really looked, and saw what he'd done, not through arrogance, but through naivety. The rain outside struck harder, drumming like guilt against the windows. "Tell me how to fix it," he whispered. Grace met his eyes. "You can't fix people, Oliver. You can only choose whether to love them anyway." The next morning, she didn't come to the orphanage. Margaret said she'd taken some days off. Oliver drove to her neighborhood, a modest street lined with tired maples, and waited in his car until lights flickered in her window. He didn't knock. He just watched the silhouette of her moving through the small apartment, folding laundry, tucking her hair behind her ear. He realized this was her real-life quiet, self-made, unremarkable to the world, but holy in its simplicity. He pressed his forehead to the steering wheel, whispering a truth he could no longer outrun. "I've never been lonelier than when I'm loved, for the wrong reasons." 2 nights later, an anonymous blog posted a leaked document, charity funds misused under Whitman Foundation. It was false. A fabrication spliced from old audits. But the story spread faster than truth could breathe. Reporters camped outside his building. The board demanded statements. Vanessa appeared on television, implying Grace had influenced him. Oliver's name trembled on the stock exchange. His company's shares dipped 3 points in a day. But none of that hurt like the call he received from Margaret. "They're questioning the orphanage. Oliver. Inspectors came this morning. Grace is devastated." He didn't wait for the elevator. He ran down 40 floors. Raincoat half-buttoned. Heart hammering. When he reached St. Francis, Grace was outside, arguing with an official. Her face was pale but steady. "They have nothing to hide," she said. "Every cent is documented." The man turned to Oliver, startled. "Mr. Whitman." "Leave," Oliver said, voice sharp enough to cut the rain. "Now." When they were alone, Grace turned on him. "This is what I feared. You brought the storm here. I'm sorry." Sorry doesn't protect the children when the donors pull out. He stepped closer. "Then let me stand with you." She shook her head. "You stand too tall, Oliver. The lightning always finds you first." Her words tore something open in him. He didn't care anymore about appearances, about the watching world. "I love you, Grace." The words fell between them like thunder, too sudden, too raw. Grace froze. "Don't," she whispered. "You think love fixes what power ruins. But it doesn't. It just makes it harder to walk away." "Then don't walk away." Her eyes glistened, but she smiled sadly. You don't know what it costs me to stay. Then let me share the cost. She looked at him for a long, trembling moment, then whispered, I believe you mean that. That's what makes it hurt more. By nightfall, the city's headlines had changed again. Billionaire defends MAID amid scandal. His board demanded he cut ties. He refused. Claire found him in his office, staring at the skyline. Oliver, she said quietly, you're losing everything. He turned to her. Then maybe I'm finally free to keep something real. She didn't argue. She just nodded, almost sadly. Then hold on to her before the world takes her, too. Grace sat alone in the chapel of the orphanage. Candles flickered, painting light across her face. She thought of the children asleep upstairs, of Oliver's voice trembling when he said, I love you. Part of her wanted to run to him. Another part wanted to protect the small, quiet life she'd built from breaking apart under the weight of his world. She whispered a prayer she didn't know she still remembered God. If he's meant to stay, give me strength to stay too. If not, teach me how to let him go kindly. Outside, the wind shifted. 2 days later, a letter arrived at Oliver's office. No signature. Just a single sentence written in looping handwriting he recognized instantly. Love isn't about saving. It's about seeing, and I see you now. He read it again and again, unsure whether it was a goodbye or a beginning. Through the glass wall, the city gleamed fractured, imperfect, alive, somewhere beneath that same skyline. Grace walked home in the rain, her heart torn open but lighter than before. Neither of them knew what tomorrow would bring, only that something had cracked, and through that crack, light was starting to pour in. The world turned cold again. Not the weather, though. November dragged its gray sleeves across Manhattan, but the silence that followed when Grace disappeared. One morning, her number stopped working. Her apartment was empty, the windows bare. Margaret said only that she'd left for somewhere quieter. Oliver stood at the orphanage gate, long after dusk, watching the lights flicker inside, the children's laughter echoing without her voice to hold it together. He didn't blame her for leaving. He blamed himself for giving her reasons to. The scandal didn't die easily. Reporters hunted every angle: his wealth, her past, their difference. Each headline stabbed deeper, cutting away what little privacy they had left. Then the market fell. Investors withdrew. Contracts vanished overnight, like bridges burning behind him. Oliver Whitman, the man who once owned half the skyline, was suddenly a man no one wanted to stand beside. The board forced him to resign. His name, once synonymous with innovation, now carried the weight of pity. On the day he signed his resignation papers, he caught his reflection in the conference room glass. The same man, but hollowed. He whispered to it, "You built everything but a home." Meanwhile, 2 states away, Grace found refuge in a coastal town called Harbor Point. She took a job at a small diner by the pier. Nothing grand, just steady. The air there smelled of salt and second chances. Each morning, she brewed coffee, smiled at strangers, and tried to forget the sound of his voice. Sometimes she almost managed to, but then a child would laugh a certain way, or a customer would mention New York, and her hands would tremble slightly, as if her heart still remembered the shape of his name. At night, she'd sit by the window of her rented room, watching the sea swallow the moonlight. She'd think about how love could be both salvation and exile. She told herself leaving was strength, but strength, she was learning, was lonelier than she'd imagined. Back in New York, Oliver's penthouse became a mausoleum of quiet. The art, the wine, the glass, all of it meaningless now. He sold most of it, not out of anger, but out of the need to breathe. He moved into a modest apartment downtown, near the Hudson, where no one cared who he was. There, surrounded by peeling paint and old radiators, he began to remember what it meant to live without applause. He volunteered at a shelter once, anonymously. The first night, no one recognized him. He ladled soup, cleaned tables, listened to stories of people who'd lost everything and still managed to laugh. He envied them, because they had nothing, but at least they weren't pretending. For the first time, Oliver realized that all the years he'd been called a self-made man, he'd never really made himself at all. He'd only built armor. Months passed before the first letter arrived. It was from Margaret. Grace is safe, but she's not the same. She doesn't sing anymore. The children ask about you. The roof still holds, thanks to you. But she won't talk about you at all. Maybe that's her way of holding on. Oliver read it 3 times, his fingers trembling. He folded it carefully, placed it in his coat pocket, and carried it everywhere, as if it could anchor him to something worth staying good for. Winter melted into spring. By then, the world had moved on. The tabloids had new scandals. The markets had recovered, and the city once again glittered with forgetfulness. But Oliver hadn't forgotten. He'd rebuilt something smaller, quieter, a foundation called Bridge Hearts, designed to support orphanages and shelters like St. Francis. No gala openings, no press, just work that mattered. He never spoke her name publicly, but every decision bore her fingerprint, the grace in every line, the care in every budget, the heart she'd lent him when he had none. And still, he wondered, was it enough? Was redemption ever enough if love was the price? One humid afternoon in May, Oliver drove north for a small charity audit, an expansion project for the foundation. The address read, Harbor Point, Maine. He almost laughed when he saw it. Fate had a cruel sense of humor. The diner appeared first blue paint, cracked sign, smell of frying butter and rain. He stopped for coffee, because old habits die slowly. When the waitress turned, the world seemed to stop moving. Grace stood behind the counter, hair tied back, sunlight catching the copper in her curls. She froze too, the glass in her hand trembling. Neither spoke at first. The air between them filled with everything they hadn't said. "Hi," she whispered finally. He smiled faintly. "You still make the best coffee in any world." Grace exhaled, half a laugh, half a sigh. "You shouldn't be here." "Probably not," he said. "But here I am." They sat outside after her shift, on a bench overlooking the pier. The sea was calm, gray, endless. Grace held her mug with both hands. "I heard about what happened. The foundation, the scandal. It's quieter now," he said. "I lost a lot, but I found enough to keep going." She nodded. "You look different." "So do you." Silence fell. Not uncomfortable, but fragile. "I thought leaving would make it easier." she said softly. It didn't. He looked at her, the ache in his chest almost physical. Then why did you? Because I didn't want to watch you fall because of me. You weren't the fall, Grace. You were the landing. Her eyes shimmered, but she shook her head. You're good with words. I wasn't, he said quietly. You taught me. A gust of wind swept across the pier, carrying the smell of salt and memory. Grace shivered, and without thinking, he took off his jacket and placed it around her shoulders. She looked up at him then, eyes deep, uncertain. Why do you keep trying? She asked. You don't owe me anything. He smiled sadly. That's the thing. I stopped doing things out of debt. You changed the way I measure worth. Her voice trembled. Oliver. Let me finish, he said. You once told me I couldn't fix people. You were right. But I learned something. Love isn't fixing. It's staying long enough to understand why someone broke. She blinked, tears glinting like sea glass. For a moment, she reached for his hand, then pulled back, unsure. But he didn't move. He waited, the way rain waits for clouds to give permission. When her fingers finally brushed his, it wasn't dramatic. It was small, real, like two puzzle pieces remembering where they belonged. As the sun sank behind the water, Grace spoke again, her voice barely above the waves. I don't know how to fit into your world. Then let's build one that fits us both, he said simply. She smiled through tears. You make it sound so easy. It's not, he admitted. But neither was losing you. The tide crept higher, whispering against the wood. They sat there until the lamps along the pier flickered on, until words were no longer needed. And in that quiet, fragile moment, Grace leaned her head against his shoulder. Neither of them said, I love you. They didn't have to. Sometimes, love isn't the promise, it's the persistence. When Oliver left the next morning, the sky was streaked with gold. Grace stood at the diner door, arms crossed, watching him go. Will you come back? She asked. He smiled. If you want me to. Her answer was simple. Then don't be late. He laughed, a sound lighter than he'd known in years, and drove off. Wind scattering the pages of his notes. In the rearview mirror, she was still there, framed by sunlight. The sea shimmering behind her like forgiveness. For the first time in a long while, Oliver Whitman wasn't running from his past. He was driving toward his future. Summer settled over Harbor Point like a held breath. Each morning smelled of salt and coffee. Each evening glowed amber against the water. Grace had begun to laugh again. Not the careful laughter of survival, but the kind that came uninvited. Soft and whole. Oliver spent most weeks between New York and the coast, rebuilding his foundation by day and repairing his heart by night. He'd learned to trade conference calls for phone calls that began with, "How was your day?" Sometimes she answered, sometimes she didn't. He never pressed. They were learning a new language, the slow grammar of people who'd already lost each other once. At the diner, people had stopped whispering. Grace was the woman with the kind smile, not the maid from the papers. Oliver blended in as the man who read the paper backward and tipped too much. On Fridays, he'd wait until her shift ended, and they'd walk the pier together, talking about nothing and everything, the children at St. Francis, the smell of rain, the way seagulls always seemed to argue with the wind. One night, she asked quietly, "Does the city miss you?" He thought about it. No. Cities don't miss people. They replace them. Then why go back every week? Because I have to prove that goodness can survive in glass towers too. Grace smiled faintly. You always did like impossible projects. He looked at her, then the sunset behind her, the wind in her hair, and said, "Not all of them are impossible." She didn't answer, but her hand brushed his for a heartbeat, long enough to promise what words still feared. By late August, Bridge Hearts had grown into something bigger than either of them expected. Donors returned. Journalists softened. Even the board reached out to reinstate him as honorary chair. Oliver refused. If they want change, they'll have to make room for people who know what pain looks like. He meant Grace, though he didn't say it. But success attracts shadows. One evening, Claire arrived at his temporary Manhattan office, eyes tired. "She's been offered a feature," Claire said, "a national magazine. They want her story, the maid who changed the billionaire." Oliver's stomach tightened. She doesn't want that. They're offering money, a lot of it. He knew then it wasn't about her wanting it. It was about someone convincing her she deserved it. He also knew who would try Vanessa. When he reached Harbor Point, the diner was closed early. Grace sat outside on the steps, a glossy magazine mock-up beside her, the sea restless beyond. She came. Grace said before he could speak, "Vanessa." Oliver's chest went cold. What did she say? That the world already made up its mind about us. So I might as well profit from the story. And what did you tell her? Grace looked down. That I'm tired of being a story at all. He sat beside her, silent. The ocean roared, impatient. "She's not wrong," Grace said softly. "Your world will never let us just be. I don't care about my world anymore. But it still cares about you," she said. "It'll pull you back the moment you stop fighting." He reached for her hand. "Then I'll keep fighting." Her fingers trembled inside his. "And when you lose?" He smiled sadly. "Then at least I'll lose for the right reason." That night the storm came without warning. Wind howled through the town. The sea rose like a wounded thing. The diner's windows rattled. Waves crashed against the pier. Grace stayed behind to help the owner secure the shutters. Oliver arrived breathless, drenched, insisting on helping. "Go home," she shouted over the wind. He shook his head. "Home is wherever you're standing." Lightning split the sky. For a second, everything shone silver her face. His fear. The truth between them. Then the power went out. They worked by flashlight, shoulders brushing, hearts racing not from the storm, but from everything that had gone unsaid. When the last window was sealed, silence filled the space where danger had been. Outside, the world screamed. Inside, it held its breath. Grace turned to him, hair plastered to her skin. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. "If I hadn't, I'd still be somewhere dry and wishing I were drowning here instead." Before she could answer, thunder rolled again, and he kissed her. It wasn't planned or perfect. It was soaked, desperate, human, like two survivors clinging to the same piece of sky. When they broke apart, She whispered. We'll regret this. Probably, he said. But not tonight. The morning came quiet and gold. Birds picked at puddles. Sunlight spilled through broken clouds. Grace stood by the window of her small apartment, one of his shirts wrapped around her shoulders. Oliver brewed coffee, awkwardly using her chipped kettle. She watched him pour it into mismatched mugs and thought, so this is what love looks like when no one is watching. He caught her gaze and smiled. Don't look at me like that. I'll start believing I belong here. Maybe you do. He walked to her, set the cup down, and brushed a damp curl from her cheek. For a moment, the world felt whole again. But peace, she knew, was just the pause between storms. A week later, Bridgeharts planned a benefit gala, their first since his resignation. The board begged him to attend. His absence would be noticed. He hesitated until they said the funds would rebuild 2 more orphanages. Grace urged him to go. They still need you, she said. They need what you gave me, he replied. I'm just the messenger now. Then go, she said. Remind them what kindness sounds like. He kissed her forehead. Only if you promise not to disappear again. She smiled, faintly. I'll try. The gala glittered crystal chandeliers, champagne laughter, the same old theater. Oliver felt like a ghost walking through his former life. Then Vanessa appeared, draped in silver, eyes sharp. So this is your redemption arc, she said sweetly, saving the world to impress the maid. He met her gaze calmly. No. To impress the man I should have been years ago. She laughed. Brittle. The world loves a fallen hero. But tell me, Oliver, what happens when she breaks your heart too? He didn't answer, because for the first time, he wasn't afraid of breaking. While he spoke on stage that night, his speech raw and unpolished, Grace watched the live stream from the diner. His voice cracked halfway through, talking about second chances, about how love taught him to measure success, not by power, but by peace. People clapped. She cried quietly. Alone. Then a customer handed her a newspaper. Anonymous donation saves local children's hospital via Bridgeharts. She smiled through tears. He'd kept his promise. He was still building something beautiful, even without her beside him. But deep down, she knew it was time to stop hiding behind safety. At midnight, when the gala ended, Oliver walked alone along Fifth Avenue. The rain had started again, light and persistent. He pulled out his phone and froze when he saw her message. Meet me where the storm began. Hours later, he reached the Harbor Point Pier. The sea shimmered under the moon. Quiet now. Forgiving. Grace stood at the end of the dock, hair whipped by wind, a lantern flickering beside her. You came back, he said. I never really left, she whispered. I was just afraid you hadn't changed. And now, she smiled through tears. Now I think maybe you finally stopped trying to save me and started letting me love you back. He stepped closer, the boards creaking beneath them. The lantern flame bent toward the wind, trembling but unbroken. He cupped her face, his voice low. You once told me real things hurt more than lies. I can live with that. Then live, she whispered. And when he kissed her again, the tide rose to meet them, salt, wind, light everything that had ever tried to pull them apart, now carrying them forward. Dawn found them sitting side by side, shoes off, feet dangling over the edge. The horizon burned pink. The world washed clean. Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. So, what now? Oliver smiled. Now we stop being a headline. We just live. She laughed softly. That might be the bravest thing either of us has ever done. The sea answered with a whisper of waves against the pier, steady, endless, alive. And beneath the calm, the fire kept burning. The morning after the storm rose clean and sharp. The world rinsed of noise. Harbor Point smelled of salt, wet wood, and the faint sweetness of something beginning again. Grace woke to the sound of gulls, sunlight spilling through the curtains, like forgiveness. Beside her, a cup of coffee steamed on the nightstand. Oliver sat by the window, barefoot, sketching on a napkin plans for a small house that didn't yet exist. She watched him in silence. For the first time, he looked utterly unguarded, as if the armor had slipped off in his sleep and he hadn't noticed. Something inside her tired, tender, cautious unfolded. They spent the next weeks learning how to be ordinary. He fixed the squeaky hinge on her door, though it squeaked again a day later. She taught him how to make clam chowder without turning it into cement. Evenings were for walking hand in hand, shoes in the sand, the tide whispering promises that neither dared to speak aloud. Sometimes he still left for the city, for meetings that demanded his presence. But now he returned, differently, less restless, more rooted. He told her about the Foundation's new program, pairing business mentors with kids from orphanages. She listened, eyes bright, already thinking of names. "This is what you were meant to build," she said. He smiled. "Maybe, but I wouldn't have known how if I hadn't met you." Grace shook her head, teasing. "You always give me too much credit, and you never give yourself enough." The wind carried their laughter down the shore, light and fragile, but real. One evening in late September, Grace returned from the diner to find Oliver sitting on the porch, a letter in his hand. From the board, she asked. He nodded. "They want me back, full control, full salary, full visibility." He hesitated. "On one condition, I leave Bridge Hearts behind. Merge it back into the company." Grace's heart tightened. "And will you?" "I don't know." He looked out toward the horizon where the sea bled into dusk. "I miss the work, the challenge, but I don't want to lose this." She sat beside him. "You won't lose me for choosing ambition." He turned to her. "That's not what I'm afraid of." "What?" "Then, that ambition will choose me and leave you behind." Her throat tightened. He was still the man who measured life in risks and returns. But now he feared losing something priceless, peace. Grace placed her hand over his. "Then promise me one thing if you go back. Go back different." He nodded slowly. "Different I can do." But as the wind rose and the first autumn leaves brushed the porch, she wondered if love was ever enough to save a man from the gravity of his old world. 2 weeks later, he left for New York, only for a few days. He said. Grace stood on the platform watching the train swallow him. At first, his messages were steady photos, jokes, late night, "I miss you." Then the gaps grew. Meetings ran long. Calls ended with, "I'll explain when I'm back." when the magazine printed a picture of him beside corporate partners at a high-profile summit. Her chest ached, not from jealousy, but from recognition. He belonged to light bulbs and glass again. That night, she sat on the pier, the sea dark and endless. A gull screeched overhead, lonely and defiant. She whispered to the wind, "Please don't let him forget the quiet." In the city, temptation came wrapped in applause. Executives praised his remarkable comeback. Investors courted him with dinners under chandeliers. They said the word legacy, like a promise. But every toast felt hollow. Every flash of a camera blinded him to something he'd left behind, the way Grace looked at him when he wasn't trying to prove anything. One night, during yet another gala, he excused himself mid-speech. He left the tuxedo jacket on a chair and walked out into the rain. By the time he reached Penn Station, his phone was soaked. Unread messages blurred. Heart hammering like the first day he'd met her. He didn't tell anyone he was coming back. Grace heard the knock just after dawn. When she opened the door, he was standing there, drenched, breathless, eyes wild with relief. "You left the city," she said, half disbelieving. "I left the noise," he answered. "It's not who I am anymore." She searched his face, afraid to believe. "You can't just walk away from that world, Oliver." "I didn't walk," he said softly. "I ran. For a heartbeat." Neither moved. Then she stepped aside, and he entered the small house that had waited for him without knowing it. Days turned into weeks. They rebuilt their rhythm, slower this time, steadier. Oliver helped expand Bridge Hearts remotely, turning it into a national network of small homes for children who'd aged out of care. Grace managed the local branch, writing proposals late at night, her handwriting looping across pages like quiet determination. They argued sometimes about money, about pace, about trust. But even in anger, they stayed. That was their new covenant, not perfect peace, but presence. One night, as they worked side by side, she looked up from her papers. "Do you ever wish things had gone differently?" He thought about it. "If they had, I'd still be rich, but not alive." She smiled, leaning closer. "Then stay alive with me." Winter returned softly that year. Snow drifted like feathers over the town. On Christmas Eve, the children from St. Francis visited Harbor Point for the first time. They brought drawings, laughter, and one crumpled note that read, "Thank you for fixing the roof and finding Miss Grace." Her smile. Oliver knelt, overcome. Grace touched his shoulder, whispering, "They don't know what you gave up for this." He looked up at her. "They don't have to. You do." In that moment, she understood the quiet truth of him, not a man saved by love, but a man still learning how to stay worthy of it. The children sang carols off-key, and in that crooked harmony, something sacred bloomed. Months later, under a field of lavender outside the town church, Grace and Oliver married with no photographers, no press, no chandeliers, just wind, sunlight, and the hum of bees. When the vows came, Grace said, "I once believed love was a risk poor people couldn't afford. But you taught me that love isn't wealth, it's courage." And Oliver replied, I used to think salvation meant being remembered. Now I know it means being forgiven. When they kissed, the crowd of children cheered, their laughter rising like bells over the sea. Years later, a reporter tracked them down, asking for the story behind the legend. Grace only smiled and pointed toward the ocean. There's no legend here, just a promise we keep every day. At sunset, they walked the pier again, older now, hands still intertwined. The horizon shimmered gold, endless. Oliver glanced at her. You ever think we were lucky? Grace laughed softly. No, we were stubborn. He kissed her temple, whispering, Promise me when tomorrow comes. We keep choosing this. She squeezed his hand. Always. The tide rose to meet their feet, warm and forgiving, and as the last light of the day melted into the sea, they stood together, two souls who had lost everything to find exactly what mattered. The end, because sometimes love isn't a miracle. It's simply the promise you keep when the world stops watching.